I've seen some grade A entitlement in my 52 years on this green earth, but nothing quite prepares you for the moment a woman in a $1,000 pantsuit looks you in the eye and demands you give her free fuel just because she decided she's the queen of the neighborhood. And honestly, picture this level of pure, unadulterated insanity because I'm just standing there, minding my own business and filling up my vintage Chevy, when Eleanor Vance comes marching across my driveway like she's leading a cavalry charge. She looks at me with that. I speak to the manager, haircut shimmering in the sun, and says, "Fill up the Porsche, Silas. As HOA president, I shouldn't have to pay for gasoline when residents are hoarding community-grade resources on private property." And when I just stared at her and told her absolutely not, she didn't skip a beat. She just whipped out her phone and dialed 911 like I just held up a bank. The smell of diesel was thick in the air, but the smell of her desperation was even thicker. And here's the thing about Eleanor's little emergency call that made it the single biggest mistake of her entire life. She had absolutely no clue who she was actually talking to. My name is Silas Thorne, and I'm a guy who spent most of his life moving things from point A to point B under a lot of pressure. Having spent 20 years in military logistics before life decided to throw me a curveball that felt more like a wrecking ball. My wife, Clara, fought a brutal battle with illness for 3 long years. And when she passed last winter, the house we'd built together felt less like a home and more like a museum of things I couldn't bear to touch anymore. So I sold it all and moved to Willow Creek Estates, a quiet little slice of suburbia where I thought I could just tinker with my trucks and fade into the background. It's a nice enough place, about 200 houses with white fences and mowed lawns. But the atmosphere changed the second Eleanor Vance moved in from some high-end gated community and decided she was the self-appointed moral compass of the zip code. Within 6 months, she'd maneuvered herself into the HOA presidency on a platform of elevating neighborhood standards, which was really just code for harassing anyone who didn't fit her vision of a country club brochure. And I watch her go after the younger family for having too many toys in the yard or the elderly couples whose grass was a 1/4 inch too long. But she mostly left me alone until she realized what I had in my garage. When I bought this place, the previous owner was an old-school contractor who'd installed a professional-grade, underground diesel and gasoline storage system, completely legal, double-walled, and permitted to the teeth, and I'd spent $15,000 of my savings upgrading it to meet every modern environmental standard because restoring old engines is the only thing that keeps my mind off the silence in my house. It's my sanctuary, the smell of motor oil and the click of the pump being a kind of therapy, and during a massive ice storm last month when the whole county went dark, I was the only person with enough fuel to keep the neighborhood's emergency generators humming. I helped 3 neighbors on my street keep their oxygen machines running. And that's when Eleanor's radar locked onto me, because she didn't see a neighbor being helpful. She saw a resource she thought she could control. A week after that storm, I got my first violation notice, a $500 fine for unauthorized industrial activity in a residential zone, and the letter was written with such venom you'd think I was running a chemical weapons plant in my backyard. I spent 3 hours printing out my permits, my fire marshal inspections, and the state agricultural exemptions that made my tank bulletproof from a legal standpoint, and I hand-delivered them to Eleanor with a polite smile, thinking that would be the end of it. But see, people like Eleanor don't care about being right. They only care about winning. And she decided that this quiet veteran with the grease under his fingernails was going to be her next trophy. Everything came to a head at the emergency HOA board meeting she called on a Tuesday night, where the community center smelled like stale coffee and the buzzing of those cheap fluorescent lights made my teeth ache. Eleanor had actually put together a PowerPoint presentation. I'm not joking, with grainy photos of my garage and red arrows pointing at my fuel pump like it was an active bomb. She stood there, clicking her laser pointer and telling my neighbors that I was a clear and present danger to their property values and their children's safety, claiming the ground was probably saturated with toxins and that my presence was degrading the aesthetic integrity of Willow Creek. I sat in the back, arms crossed, watching people I'd shared beer with start to shift in their seats and look at me with suspicion, because fear is a hell of a drug when it's served up by someone in a designer blazer. When she finished her theatrical performance and moved for a vote to force me to excavate the tank within 48 hours, I stood up, and the screech of my chair on the linoleum sounded like a gunshot. I didn't yell. I just walked to the front and laid a manila folder on the table that was thick enough to be a phone book. And I told the room that before they voted on a lawsuit that would bankrupt the HOA and legal fees, they might want to hear from the actual fire chief, who just happened to be sitting in the second row. Chief Miller stood up, looking bored as he told the crowd my setup was actually safer than the local gas station, and that Eleanor had called his office 17 times in 1 week, trying to get him to lie on a report. The room went dead silent, the kind of silence that happens right before a storm breaks. And then Mrs. Gable, a 90-year-old sweetheart from down the block, stood up and told everyone how I'd sat in her freezing living room for 6 hours during the storm just to make sure her heater didn't fail. Eleanor's face turned a shade of purple I didn't know the human body could produce, and she adjourned the meeting without a vote. But I saw her in the parking lot, hunched over her phone with her acrylic nails clicking like a predator's teeth. I thought maybe she'd retreat, but 2 days later, a city zoning inspector showed up at my door, looking exhausted as he told me someone had filed an anonymous tip claiming I was running an illegal commercial fuel business and evading state taxes. I gave him the tour, showed him the books, and let him see that I wasn't charging a dime for the fuel I gave away during the storm. And as he was leaving, he told me that filing false reports with the city was a serious offense that carried a $5,000 fine, and he hinted very strongly that he knew exactly who'd made the call. That evening, I was under my truck, elbow deep in a transmission job, when I heard the unmistakable click-clack of Eleanor's heels on my driveway. And when I slid out from under the chassis, she was standing there with a look of pure, unadulterated smugness. She didn't even acknowledge the inspector's visit. She just held out a folder and told me that the HOA was suing me for neighborhood endangerment, and that if I didn't want to spend the next 5 years in court, I should just sign over the property and move out. And then she did it. She told me she'd already contacted the local police and filed a report for harassment and stalking, claiming I'd been following her car and making threatening gestures, and she smiled, that cold, reptilian smile, and said, "I have friends in high places, Silas, and a man with your background really shouldn't be making enemies with people who control the narrative." I wiped the grease off my hands, took a long, slow breath, and finally decided to let the cat out of the bag, because I've been playing the part of the quiet, grieving widower for too long. I looked at her and said, "Eleanor, I think it's time you know what I do for a living." And she just laughed, telling me she didn't care if I was a mechanic or a janitor, but her laughter died a very quick death when I pulled my badge out of my pocket. See, I'm not just a logistics guy. After the military, I'd spent 15 years in law enforcement, and 3 months ago, I've been sworn in as the chief of police for this very district. I've been keeping it quiet because I wanted to mourn my wife in peace without everyone in the neighborhood treating me like a cop, but Eleanor had just handed me a silver platter of criminal activity. "You just filed a fabricated police report against the chief of police," I told her, and for the first time, I saw the blood drain from her face until she looked like a ghost. "That's a felony, Eleanor. And since I know you used the HOA's official legal fund to hire that private investigator who's been sitting at the end of my block for 3 days, an investigator who, by the way, called me an hour ago to apologize because he realized he was being paid to tail a law enforcement official, I'm thinking we should talk about where exactly the neighborhood dues have been going. It turns out, when you're the chief of police and someone tries to frame you, you have a lot of resources at your disposal. And over the next 48 hours, I did a little digging into the Willow Creek financial records that Eleanor had been keeping under lock and key. It wasn't just a few $100s. Eleanor had been funneling tens of thousands of dollars into consulting firms owned by her own family members, charging the neighborhood for landscaping and security that never actually happened. And it was a textbook embezzlement scheme that had been running for nearly a year. Totaling it up, she'd swindled the community out of nearly $60,000 while she was busy yelling at people for their mailbox colors. The end didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened on my driveway, where Eleanor had originally tried to demand free gas. The deputies arrived on a Friday morning, and as the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists in front of the whole neighborhood, she wasn't screaming about property values anymore. She was just sobbing about how her life was over. I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the Range Rover get towed away because it had been purchased with HOA funds, and as the cruiser pulled out of the neighborhood, I felt a weight lift that I've been carrying since Clara died. Willow Creek is quiet again now, And the new HOA board consists of people who actually care about each other, like Mrs. Gable and the young couple with the basketball hoop. And honestly, I still fill up my trucks and I still help my neighbors when the power goes out, but nobody asks for free gas anymore. It's funny how a little bit of power can make a person think they're untouchable, but it's even funnier how quickly that power vanishes when they pick a fight with the wrong person. But it makes me wonder how many other neighborhoods out there are being run by someone like Eleanor. And how many people are sitting in silence because they're afraid to speak up? Have you ever had a neighbor who thought they were above the law? Or a Karen who tried to ruin your life only for it to blow up in their face? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments, because sometimes justice isn't just a badge. It's a neighbor who knows how to fight back.